IRP National Poverty Fellows visiting this week, and we are also excited to have Maretta McDonald with us to talk about the county line, an analysis of race and place in the child support enforcement system. I know we have a lot of folks in here who do child support work, and I'm very excited to hear about it. So,
Thank
Maretta.
you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am really excited to share my research with you today. This is a project in development that I am using my dissertation data. And the concepts I've thought about for a while, but the level of analysis and the way I'm conceptualizing place is a little different. So I'm really excited to get feedback and critique on this, more feedback, less critique, on this, on this project. And I'm really excited because this is a place where my people are, and they're the high quality and quantity of child support researchers here at IRP makes this really special for me. And I'd also like to thank my mentor for all of her guidance on this project as we're developing it, Dr. Sarah Halpin-Meakin. So my dissertation project also has informed a policy brief that I'm doing at ASPE that's going around for approvals now, and I'll let you guys know when that comes out. And so the title of this project is The County Line, an analysis of race and place in the child support enforcement system. It's kind of a play on The Color Line by Du Bois. So here's my slide of the people that gave me money and data. So how did I decide I wanted to study child support at a more micro level than the individual level? Well, it started when I was a caseworker in child support in Louisiana, and I worked an urban county and a rural county, and I noticed vast differences in the processes, the populations, and the court personnel across the counties or parishes in Louisiana. So child support matters in rural county courts were handled on the same day as a murder case, a malfeasance in office, somebody stole firewood. And meanwhile, urban child support cases were more bureaucratic and administrative, and only 4D court cases were being handled on those days. Although most of the matters were resolved by caseworkers before the court began in both places, the atmospheres of courts in these locations were different. Across the rural and non-rural spaces, I also noticed there was a different level of dread from non-custodial parents, depending on which court they were in. In rural areas, they were more scared of going to jail. In non-rural areas, they just wanted the process to be over because it was going to be a long day in court. So there were also different outcomes based on the place. So, however, one thing was consistent. Whether I was in a rural or urban court, the majority of the custodial and non-custodial parents were Black. So this difference and sameness made me question about how place and race intersect to shape the individual and community level experiences with child support enforcement. And as a sociologist who examines social structure and how it interacts with individual agency, there is very little research on child support as a state institution. Existing research has given us important insight, by people that's actually in this room, on individual level relationships with child support issues as policy, as well as demographic overviews. And a lot of this work is driven by the discipline of social work and law and framed from a poverty lens. However, there's little theorizing about structural factors and how they may intersect with child support enforcement outcomes and the patterns that are often invisible at an individual level, right? I was also thinking through my experience in the field while reading the work of Du Bois, and especially the Philadelphia Negro and Souls of Black Folks, which allow me to kind of conceptualize the structural explanations for this difference and sameness, right? And in these two studies, he points out the major ways racism is structured across place. He points out that more formal systems like job discrimination and racial segregation were used to oppress Black people in Philly. Meanwhile, in rural Georgia, He pointed out that racism was more patriarchal as Jim Crow laws and norms structured the lives of rural populations, especially because there was less residential segregation in rural areas. So he said black and white people had more interactions in rural areas, and they were black people were more socially oppressed and required to subjugate themselves in a different way to survive in these rural areas. So while these two studies are conducted in different regions of the country, rural was in the South, urban was in the Midwest, Northeast. I had to shift where I was looking on the map in my head. All states really have a mix of both, right? So thinking about how racism may be structured differently across place, seems a potential explanation for what I witnessed in Louisiana courts. And lastly, there's been a lot of innovation in how conceptualizing space and place in poverty research realm that can be used to help explain the variation across different places, like counties. One of these is the spatial regime methodology conceptualized by Dr. Catherine Curtis, who is also here in Wisconsin. And I will talk a little more about that in the methodology and in Q&A if you want to talk about it. But there are new methods that allow us to interrogate the way the same characteristics can explain different amounts of variation in child support enforcement outcomes across rural and non-rural divide. So let me set the scene for Louisiana and how place structures communities. As many of you know, Louisiana is characterized as a Deep South state, and most of the state is part of the Mississippi Delta region. Being part of the Deep South influences the relationships between the structural aspects of race and the people in Louisiana. Attributes of the Deep South include historic reliance on slave labor for economic growth, as well as reliance on staple crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. In addition to this, continued racial and economic exploitation is also an attribute of the region. As part of the Mississippi Delta region, there are a number of structural, economic-related characteristics that shape the lives of communities in Louisiana. Most of the counties in the region are rural. And additionally, the region itself lends itself to social isolation. Researchers argue that social isolation allows landowners and political leaders to constrict educational opportunities and to the development of new economic opportunities. Related to these, other aspects of the Mississippi Delta region is higher poverty concentration, higher unemployment rates, outmigration or like brain and skill drain, and underdevelopment when compared to the rest of the country. Therefore, based on these social and economic implications of Louisiana being a Deep South state and part of the Mississippi Delta, we can infer that the relationship between child support enforcement outcomes and the socioeconomic structures of Louisiana will lead to different outcomes compared to other states, like Wisconsin, for instance. And it will be more like a Mississippi, maybe. However, I argue that there is also the county level difference that results within state variation in child support enforcement system outcomes, and that's across rural and non-rural. Y'all read that right quick. Hold on. Y'all finished? Okay. There's a lot of important work in rural sociology that examine rural communities compared to their more urban counterparts. The variation between rural and non-rural areas of the same disadvantaged regions, like the Deep South and the Mississippi Delta, helps us conceptualize the characteristics that make place important in this analysis. In rural areas, there are larger disadvantaged populations proportionally than their non-rural counterparts. There are higher poverty rates, especially child poverty. There are more working poor in rural areas as well. And the working poor are people who work 27 hours a week, at least 27 hours a week in the workforce, but still qualify as under the official poverty line. Also, larger populations of Black and Native populations are in rural areas. My second and third points are closely interrelated, so I'll talk about them together. And that's human capital and specialized economies. On average, there are fewer industries in rural areas there may be one manufacturing plant, one mine. Everybody does sugarcane farming. So those would be specialized economies, whereas non-rural economies are more diverse, with many employment options across the state. Specialized economies limit the earning potential and employment options in the county. Because of this, having advanced education does little for upward mobility, and there is a lower return for education, including specialized skills. Additionally, if you are the only game in town, right, then that increases the chance of economic and racial exploitation, resulting in lower wages as well as job discrimination when examined from a racial threat perspective. Lastly, geographic isolation is another attribute of rural areas. They are not located close to urban centers that have more diverse jobs, and there is no public transportation if you lack transportation to get to those urban centers. So the geographic isolation of rural areas further disadvantages low-income communities in these areas. Now relating all of this back to child support system, we would assume that there will be a lot of unpaid child support in these areas based on the economic makeup, right? We would also think that there will be less current support due in these areas due to cumulative disadvantage of the area, but child support is calculated purely on income standard guidelines, right? And if the child support system is purely a policy regime, then we will believe that it would operate the same across the state, and this would be the case for every county, right? The difference in the economic structure between rural and non-rural places is enough by itself to justify examining the influence of place. However, I argue that the intersection of race and place are also important in this research because of the different way racism is institutionalized across rural and non-rural contexts. As many of you know, there are a lot of enlightening research on child support policy, especially at the individual level. We've learned about the characteristics of custodial and non-custodial parents, what populations are likely to engage with and benefit from child support enforcement. We've learned about programming, sanctions, case management styles that are effective in all aspects of child support processes. What's missing is looking at the environment that these families live in every day and the privileges and constraints embedded in place that underlie many of these aspects. A lot of policymakers and politicians think child support is a one-size-fits-all policy, assuming that what works for one population is effective for all, right? But that is where a lot of the work of the scholars in this room on low-income parents becomes so important. Through this, we learn about unintended impact of child support on low-income and poor families, especially non-custodial parents. Yet we need to complicate this by also looking at the structural factors of where people live and the cultural context of their lives. For example, a job training class that teaches you to fill out an application, helps you get clothes for an interview, would be less useful in a rural area that has no jobs and no access to jobs. Lastly, research on child support enforcement has given us a lot of knowledge on the relationship between child support enforcement and the outcomes of families across geographies and nationally. Most of them have nationally representative data that draws on large cities, or there are individual analyses in states like Maryland, Mississippi, Wisconsin, on child support and other interrelated social policy programs. I found little research that focuses on child support enforcement outcomes in rural areas where things are culturally and structurally different as observed when I was a caseworker. So the way I'm framing child support is outside of it, it's just as a policy realm, right? I'm examining the child support enforcement system as a state institution that defines responsibility and what families should be by having the authority to sanction these norm breakers, right? This system operates similarly and is directly linked to the criminal legal system that defines responsible behavior and societal integration by sanctioning and removing those who break laws that are passed based on norms of the time, right? Examining social and state institution literature, the child support system qualifies as a state institution by aligning with at least these two attributes. First, it's an entity within which the United States government has delegated its power to use physical force and coercion. The child support enforcement system has the administrative and judicial power to compel people to appear as well as incarcerate. They also have the power to coerce compliance using a number of sanctions like driver's license suspension, asset seizure, and forfeiture. Additionally, state institutions have a broadly accepted ideology that legitimizes it and its authority by extension of its policy practices. So the ideology about family, gender roles, and responsibilities are what legitimizes child support enforcement and cause it to institutionalize family relationships. Examining the child support system as a state institution allows us to see the broader patterns of child support entanglement in low-income communities. So taking the spatial context and research environment under advisement, I developed the following research questions. Based on the argument that child support enforcement is a state-administered policy and what we know about Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta, I wanted to know how the structural and racial ethnic makeup of place predicts child support enforcement system performance measures. I also wanted to know how does the social demographic context of a county shape the level of child support system engagement in a county. So I have two outcome variables that measure different contexts of community engagement. One is the average monthly current child support due rate in a county and the average number of cases with arrears in a county. So first we're going to look at the current child support due in a county that measures the policy context of how embedded child support enforcement is within a community. So higher current child support rates allows us to see the patterns of how policies are shaped by the structural context of a place, right? So in my hypothesis, I theorized the relationships that child support enforcement system outcomes have with the structural context of policy in Louisiana. So when it comes to state mandated cooperation levels in a county, we expect that there will be higher current support due rates in counties with higher system involvement. The relationship between human capital and child support would be negative, and the higher the proportion of people with low human capital, the lower the rate of current child support. The counties with worse economic conditions, the lower the current monthly child support due rate. Next, after controlling for all of these conditions on which Black and non-Black communities vary, there should be no significant relationship between the child support enforcement system and the size of the racial, ethnic population in a county. And lastly, because it's a statewide policy, there should be no difference across place, right? However, based on the insight gained from Du Bois and how institutions operate differently based on cultural context of place, for example, the different ways racism shaped social and economic relationships between rural and non-rural places, I would argue that non-white racial concentration has a positive relationship with the current child support due, with more child support due in counties with higher Black population. I would also hypothesize that there would be a significant difference between the factors in non-rural and rural areas. So this shows the hypothesis just based on the context of what we know about the place and the policy, not the theory about the intersection of race. And now with cases with arrears, this is when we think about the mandatory cooperation components, we'd expect a positive relationship between the other program involvement and the rate of cases with arrears in the county. We should also be a positive relationship between the portion of people with lower human capital and cases with arrears. The economic environment should also dictate the number of cases with arrears rate. As worse economic conditions is associated with more cases being behind. The racial makeup, again, should not have a significant effect on the amount of cases with arrears in the county after controlling for child support related factors. Lastly, as a state, we should be able to expect that there will be no significant difference between the models across rurality. However, when I take into consideration racialization of similar state institutions and the intersection of race and place, I hypothesize that the size of the non-white population has a positive relationship with the number of cases with arrears in a county, and there will be a significant difference across rurality. These are my measures. Go ahead and read that while I sip of water. Do y'all want me to explain the measures, or you come back to this during the Q&A? Y'all read them? All right. So to analyze the data, I used the spatial regime technique. This technique looks at the difference across theoretically defined places or spaces. In this analysis, I'm using those aspects of the Deep South and Mississippi Delta and how they may differ across the rural and non-rural counties. It allows us to see whether certain factors are more closely associated with outcomes in rural areas or non-rural areas when it comes to understanding the variation in child support enforcement performance measures or outcomes. So I ran 2 models for each outcome, a subsample of rural, then a subsample of non-rural. And this type of modeling acts as a fully interactive model where each variable interacts with the reality of the county. Each model and coefficient is tested for statistical difference across models, and each model tells us how the variables explain the outcomes in place. In this case, rural and non-rural counties. So let's look at how the findings shook out. All right, these are my descriptives of all the variables, and you can see that 8 of the variables are statistically different, with 7 of the 8 being higher in rural areas. The Hispanic population is significantly different, but they're larger in urban areas. We can also see that the difference in the Black population size across rural and non-rural divide is not significant at the 95% confidence level, but it is in the same direction, with rural counties having marginally larger Black populations on average in Louisiana. So I have all the regression numbers for you. They're in the back. But I'm going to present it just like, did I prove my hypothesis, so we can think through this as communities of people instead of just numbers, okay? And then when you want to see the numbers, I know y'all will, we'll get to those in Q&A. Oh, that was supposed to be about the Black part. I was supposed to click that. All right. Here we have the, first we're going to review the current child support outcome results. So I hypothesized that there would be a positive relationship between the mandatory variables of welfare participation and child Medicaid participation rate and the amount of average monthly support due in a parish. What the results provide partial evidence supports the hypothesis, as welfare participation had no significant relationship with the amount of current support due in a county, while Medicaid participation has strong positive relationship. There was no significant difference in the coefficients across rural and non-rural counties. Next, I hypothesized that there would be a negative relationship between low human capital in a county and percent of the population who had a high school diploma or less, and the current child support due. As the percent of people with low human capital increases, I found a positive relationship that the amount of child support due in that county also increased. So the relationship was not significant in non-rural areas, but significant in rural areas. And the coefficients were statistically different across models. Regarding the economic environment of a county, I expected that there would also be a negative relationship. So if a county is high in poverty, there will be less current child support due. And as employment rates increase, there would be less current child support due in a county. Also, if there was a specialized county, there will be less child support due. Well, the findings were mixed on that as well. High poverty counties had a significantly higher current child support due in rural areas and no significant relationship in non-rural areas, which does not provide evidence for this hypothesis, but the coefficients were not statistically different, which is probably more a case of there being more high poverty counties in rural areas. The unemployment rate has the expected negative relationship with current child support amount in rural counties supporting their hypothesis, but no relationship in non-rural counties, and the two coefficients are statistically different. Compared to unspecialized counties, farming and recreation-dependent and mining counties have a significantly higher current child support amount in non-rural areas and no relationship in rural counties, which does not support my hypothesis, and both coefficients are also statistically different. Manufacturing-dependent counties have significantly higher current child support due amounts compared to unspecialized counties in both rural and non-rural counties. And these coefficients are not in the hypothesized direction, and they're not statistically different from each other. Lastly, federal and state government-dependent counties have statistically lower child support amounts in both rural and non-rural areas, which supports the hypothesis. But these coefficients are not statistically different from each other. Lastly, I hypothesized that the racial ethnic concentration of a county would not have a significant relationship with the amount of current child support due in a county after controlling for other factors. However, if the child support system is a racialized institution that differs across place, then non-white populations will have a positive relationship. So the results provide evidence for the alternate hypothesis of child support enforcement as a racialized system, especially in rural areas. The percentage of Black and Native and Hispanic populations had a positive relationship with the current child support due in a county. The size of the Black and Hispanic population does not have a significant relationship with child support due in non-rural areas. The only significant non-white population size relationship in non-rural counties is Native Americans, and it is to a positive relationship. And the coefficients for the size of the Black and Hispanic populations are statistically different across rural and non-rural models. Lastly, the rural and non-rural spatial regime models are also statistically different from one another. So next we'll review the cases with the rear outcomes. I hypothesized that there would be a positive relationship with mandatory cooperation. The results provided evidence to support this, as welfare participation had no significant relationship with the number of cases with arrears in rural counties, but a positive relationship in non-rural counties. Medicaid participation had a strong positive relation in both, but there was no statistical difference between non-rural and rural areas. We also thought that there would be a positive relationship between low human capital in a county and the number of cases with arrears. And there were mixed results here too. There was a positive relationship in rural areas. So as the percentage of the population that has low human capital in rural area increases, the number of cases with arrears in that county also increases. In contrast, this relationship in non-rural areas is negative, and the coefficients are statistically different across place. So back to the economic environment of a county, that I expected that there would be a positive relationship with the number of cases with arrears in a county. The findings are again a mixed. High poverty counties has no significant relationship with high numbers of cases with arrears in rural counties, yet it has a significant positive relationship in non-rural counties, and the coefficients are statistically different. Unemployment rates has a negative relationship with the number of cases in rural counties, failing to support this hypothesis, but no relationship in non-rural counties, and the two coefficients are statistically different. Compared to unspecialized counties, farming, recreation dependent has a higher number of cases. Mining has a significantly lower number of cases in rural counties and a significantly higher number of cases with arrears in non-rural counties. And the two coefficients are significantly different. Manufacturing counties has no significance with the number of cases in arrears in rural counties, but a significant difference, positive relationship in non-rural counties. Lastly, federal and state employment has significantly fewer cases with arrears in rural areas, failing to provide evidence for the hypotheses, and there's no relationship in non-rural counties. So lastly, I again hypothesized that the racial ethnic concentration of a county will not have a significant relationship with the number of cases with arrears in a county after controlling for other factors. Or child support is racialized, right? So what I found was that there was a positive relationship with the percentage of Black, Native, and Hispanic population in rural counties. So the size of the Black and Hispanic population do not have a significant relationship with the number of cases with arrears in non-rural counties. The only significant non-rural population size is non-white population size is a non-rural is Native Americans again. And all of these are statistically different across rural and non-rural places. And again, the two models were also statistically different. So when we think through the issues of racial and social inequality, I expect many of the findings that didn't align with the hypothesis from a policy provision lens. However, there was one very unexpected finding, and that was the difference in the R-squared. So the same specification of the models by place explained more of the variation in current support due in a county in rural areas than in non-rural areas by about 9 percentage points. And all of my stats people know that's big, which is approximately a 16% improvement in the model when it's modeled on rural areas. But wait, there's more. The same variable in the model explains 16 percentage points more of the variation in the number of cases with arrears in rural areas compared to non-rural areas. That is about a 23% improvement in the model fit in rural areas compared to non-rural areas. So what does all of this mean, right? What it means is that child support is a racialized system, and it also mirrors other systems that are in state institutions like the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, and welfare. And so this also extends the literature by showing that this racialization of institutions operates differently across place as theorized by Du Bois. The results also infer that mandatory cooperation policies still have an effect on the outcomes of child support enforcement, even with the reduction of welfare cases. And we see that participation in needs-based program increases the level of engagement with communities with the system. However, TANF has less of an effect on current cases and more effect on cases with arrears, which aligns with literature that finds that the majority of arrears are owed to the state. These results also show the influence of the environment within which families live on the outcomes of child support enforcement, which translate to the ability to pay, cooperation, and poverty reduction. Counties that have multiple disadvantages like rurality, high unemployment, and high poverty have more child support debts than those with more advantage. So that may mean that there are more people in these counties, say for instance with suspended licenses, right? Which is an economic hazard to everyone in the community. Because if they have a suspended license, they still go drive. And if they get in a car accident, they don't have no insurance. So if everyone is poor in the area and you get in a car accident with someone else, they most likely only have liability insurance, which means they can't get another car till income tax time, which is related to their family economic position, right? So lastly, the findings infer that place matters in policy administration, as the difference between rural and urban area child support outcomes may be related to the uses of discretion that is guided by how norms and interpersonal relationships are structured by place. This aligns with literature on rural and non-rural difference in poverty research like TANF take-up, right? And criminal legal research on disproportionate sentencing practices. So scholars argue that differences are explained by variation in normative structures and the density of acquaintanceships, which leads to deterring poor people from applying for services and cases sentencing disparity, especially in rural areas. So in the policy environment, I'm thinking that these findings may help bring forward the need for collaboration between the child support enforcement system and rural development agencies in order to broaden the jobs and economic opportunities for those that live in rural areas. I also argue that child support outcomes outside of the middle class setting should consider in-kind contribution and parenting time more heavily for different communities that may value parent-child relationship contributions more heavily than financial contributions. And this may help soften the effects of the relationship between structural environment within which these families live and the variation of child support enforcement outcomes. So in order to find the mechanisms that are underlying these findings, future research should do court observations to better understand the role of a county's culture and court processes on the rural and non-rural divide in child support outcomes. We should also look at the court's records and case records that show the progression of case management over the life course of a case to understand if there are patterns that shape this difference. Lastly, I suggest that we talk to child support court professionals in rural and non-rural courts to learn about their processes and understanding that they have about the populations they serve. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this inspires some ideas, questions, critiques, less critiques. So, and I'm ready for the question and answer. Yes.
Thank you. Great job, Maretta. I have two questions.
Okay.
One is super quick. When you were referring to USDA data,
Mm-hmm.
was that the rural urban continuum codes, or was it?
Yes, that's what, well, I used their data for all of my demographics because they, the way that they restructure ACH data makes it very relevant for studying rural areas. And so all of my demographic data and the county continuum all came from the ERS data.
Awesome. Thanks. That was mostly just me being curious. My other question is one stemming from me being very ignorant about this topic in general. Also, I haven't looked at your models, so... You
want to see them? You want to see them, don't you?
That's okay, we don't have to. But I'm wondering about how the cost of living between urban and rural areas plays into this, and how that may factor into your model. So I'm thinking about how, you know, whatever amount is awarded to someone in like New Orleans, like how that compares to the like nominal dollar amount that you're comparing it with in like some county in like the Bayou,
Right.
and whether that's adjusted for in your model.
Well, it's
Whether
not.
It matters.
It's not, and the reason it's not is because it's supposed to be a statewide policy guided by guidelines that's supposed to factor in all of that when they order the child support, right?
Okay.
And so if it's based on income, if you have a lower income in a rural area, then you should have a lower child support order, which should adjust for that cost of living.
Okay, so that should all be like normalized by the
Yes,
time you're
yes,
adopting.
yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
This is really interesting. I'm a big fan of Rutgers, by the way, for rural urban.
They're pretty cool.
I was really interested about your first measure.
Okay.
Amount due. Can you just talk a little bit more about how that's constructed?
Yes.
And how you construct it, and then how, the whatever authority sets that at
Okay.
the case level?
Okay. So child support guidelines sets the amount of child support for each family based on these combined calculations of what the state believes it should cost a family to take care of any number of children, right? And so then when they do this calculation, they divide out, oh, well, she makes 1,000, he makes 2,000, so he is responsible for 66% of what it would take to make care of the child. And so that is the amount he's supposed to put back into the family, right? And so the data that I got from the Louisiana Child Support Enforcement Office was the data that they give each year to the federal government that and it's part of their performance measures. So they have to have so much amount of money in current support orders and so much movement on cases with arrears in order to continue to get the level of funding. But they give that just at the state level, so I asked them to give it to me at the county level. And so what I did next was I had to theorize a way to standardize it across counties so that population wouldn't matter. So what I did with the first iteration was I took the county, the raw county amount of current support due, and I standardized it by population for people from 18 to 65 who I theorized would still have cases in the system, right? And I didn't do it just by people who actually have cases, because my argument is that it in fact affects the entire community. So like if there's more child support in this county, then more people are in debt in this county, more people's resources are taxed in this county, which makes a difference for their family who might be trying to provide additional support to them, their mom who might be trying to pay it, and things like that. So that's how I standardized it so it could be compared.
So it's like the measure of how much child support activity is going on in the county.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So because I was in my head, I was thinking about like a per family. Yeah, I think it really speaks to your hypothesis in a way that it personally. So I think that might be an opportunity to talk about that up front.
Okay.
That's super.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Oh, who was first? Okay, go.
So I have heard in regards to Louisiana that people never move, that like their families are very rooted in place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at least in our state, there's a lot of conversation about out-migration from rural areas.
Mhm.
So I'm curious sort of how you think about population migration in this context.
Well, I hadn't. And it is one thing is because I did percentage of the population and not the actual number of people. And so when I checked the 1990 percentages and the 2000 percentages and the 2010 percentages, it was roughly the same, even though we don't have the 2020 percentages yet. So it was roughly the same of the different number of rural and urban counties. So when because I'm looking at the county level, and the percentage of people in the county didn't really change so much.
But it just might be interesting to think a little bit about it, because from what I understand,
Mhm.
not expert in this area at all, there's been a lot more out-migration of rural areas from the most educated.
Right.
Right, and so I just,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's why I use the low educational attainment because of that shift out of brain drain in rural areas. So that would kind of control for that. Does you think? Okay. I was hoping you was gonna maybe give me another measure to try.
I think it's interesting to think about who moves and who doesn't move, and
Right.
what that means for rural communities.
Okay.
That's all.
All right. Thank you.
Not an expert.
Thank you.
This was very interesting, and I have a lot of questions and ideas and thoughts. But one thing that I'm curious about
Okay.
is, like, so your measures are, right, like, in a polishing regime, there shouldn't be differences by race.
Right.
Especially because we have these guidelines, and they're supposed to be setting
Right.
order amounts in a fair.
Right. Right.
So I guess, like, what, I'm curious, I know your next steps sort of are gonna get at mechanisms.
Mhm.
I'm curious to hear you talk about, like, the mechanisms, like the pressure points in the system where you think this might be happening. Like, is it default orders? Like, is it, like, sort of what is the underlying piece of that? That you could, if, like, in respect. post
COVID, where now some services and applying for services, that maybe some barriers have been removed by allowing for like virtual services or different things like that, and that maybe there are different job opportunities in rural areas if you can work from home or work online, that there might be any changes in that, like, at all.
Funny you asked, because I just asked the state for new information, more updated. I'm hoping they give it to me. And so also, from what I have heard about rural areas and talking with some of my caseworker friends, they're in Louisiana, not so much.
Yeah, and I know there's like broadband issues. And
Yes, and those were a lot of the issues. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So but I'm hoping to look at pre, during, and post, especially with all the incentive monies that were available with unemployment and the federal incentives that at least they got the second one, and things like that, and how that might have impacted my models, especially in rural areas where they're less likely to get other kind of monies and have access to other kind of programs. Well, hold on, there's one person behind you, and then I'm gonna get to you. Yes.
Thank you. I think about place a lot in different contexts, and I'm wondering about the designation of rural and urban. Does that data come to you as just dichotomous? There's no suburban? Like, 'cause sometimes that's like 30% of your population.
There is suburban. However, when I tried, it's I have a low end. It's only 320 cases, right? And so I'm thinking about I was talking to Dan Meyer, y'all know him, and we were talking through maybe kicking out the urban and doing because there's only 5 urban counties in the state. And so the rest may be the urban adjacent suburban. They wouldn't call them suburban there because they ain't suburban. But technically they're suburban. And so, so I'm thinking about looking at it as suburban and rural instead of just lumping those other 5 in to see what difference it makes. Because I don't have enough data to look at, and I would like to look at that relationship where there's more data, like in Wisconsin, where they have all this data. I have a meeting with somebody tomorrow to talk to her about that. She might be in this room, and her name might be Molly. So, but yes, I wasn't able to, and I thought through that as well, but the data wouldn't let me do it. Thank you. Yes.
This is just curiosity because I'm not familiar really with the child welfare system. What happens when someone when a case is in arrears? Like, what kinds of like punitive things happen to that family, and does it compound, and like what happens?
Oh, okay. I could write a whole paper about that by itself. Okay, especially from my community perspective. Well, they have a lot of administrative sanctions and ways they coerce payments. One of the primary ways that payments are collected is through wage assignment when you have a job and they just take it out your check, right? But if that doesn't work, then they go, and it's not always in order of harshness either. And so they can suspend your driver's license, they can seize and freeze your bank account, put liens on your unmovable property. They can take movable property, auction it, and give the money to the mom. They can put you on a civil probation. You can be thrown in jail. Am I missing something, Dr. Pate? Okay. And so it's like this continuum. In Louisiana, the maximum amount of time you can do is 90 days for child support debt. But if they charge you as a federal case, you can go to federal prison for 2 years. So, yes. And there's a lot, I'm reading a book now, there's a big feedback loop, especially for previously incarcerated people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, because you were incarcerated, your child support went up, and now you have this big debt, but you can't get a job because you was incarcerated, so your child support goes up. And then now you're incarcerated because you can't pay your child support because you was in jail and you can't get a job. So, yeah, that population is additionally disadvantaged. Yes,
I have another question.
yes.
Okay, so you, on one of your slides, one of the, maybe it was the implication slide, you said that one possibility would be to think more about informal support.
Right.
Can you say more about how you see that working, or like that just generally?
Well, and some states are actually doing this now. There was a county because California has independent county systems. So there's a county in California that's like talking to the custodial parent. I don't like this formula, but they're doing it. They didn't ask me anything. So they they talk to the custodial parent. They say, how much time does he spend with the children? Does he pick them up? Does he babysit them? Does he take them to school and stuff? And how much do you think that's worth? And so if she says that she thinks that this is worth $100 a month, then they'll give him credit or reduce his obligation. But then, because I can't remember, it's either credit or obligation reduction. And but then if she comes back and says he's not doing it, then it reverses. So those are some of the ways that it can be done. So I would envision that we would actually reduce the child support obligation amount based on some kind of formula set outside of needing the custodial parents, her saying, it's worth $100. And so I would think more like, say if she says that every evening he has the kids while I go to work, how much is that in daycare? You know, if she had to pay daycare, how much would that be? So maybe give him enough credit for that, you know, in some kind of formula, which would reduce their debt and things like that. On its own, huh, Molly?
I mean, some try the child support program.
They do that too, yes.
Option, but like my understanding is that it's very complex.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of all parties involved have to.
But that's what we want, right? That all the parties be involved, and you have some agency in how you're structuring what your family should look like. You know, everybody's here at the table saying, okay, I'm there all the time, even though she needs this Medicaid for my child. We both poor, you know, so how can we make this not seem like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do as a dad? Because stigma is a really big thing when it comes to child support. So yes, complicated, but you know, we do complicated things all the time. Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to go to my details wrong, but, so can you talk more about the imputed child support? And I just wanna make sure I understand what that word means.
Okay.
Which is like, I'm unemployed, but the judge says, well, you should be employed, and so I'm gonna act like you actually have a job, and I'm gonna charge you child support at this higher amount, even though you currently don't have a job.
Correct. So in Louisiana, they say, for instance, you're not working now, but maybe you worked a year ago. They can pull your Department of Labor printout and average that across 12 months and say, this is your potential earning. However, if that's less than what minimum wage is, they'll say you could at least work 40 hours minimum wage. Nothing's wrong with you, you're not disabled. So we'll impute you at this much based on that earning potential. And so that's two of the ways. Or say, for instance, he's self-employed and owns a company. They will ask for your tax return so you can see how much he earned, even though, and then they'll go above it and saying, but, you know, I don't think you claimed everything. You know, I just saw you build the community center up the street, so you had to get more money than that, and then they'll impute it higher. Especially in rural areas, those kinds of informal context comes up a lot.
So what kind of guidance or policy does this state have about when that can happen? And is there any thing that they have to, at a state policy level, take into consideration about the local economy? So I'm just thinking of, this is where I'm not remembering it right, but I recall that at least at some point the state of Michigan had for TANF a different work participation rate
Mm-hmm.
if the county had an unemployment rate that was above X.
Right.
Now, that's a state where
Mm-hmm.
perhaps the rural population is more likely to be white.
Right.
So, just curious if any states have like at a statewide level a policy about child support and how you determine that minimum child support order, taking into consideration local economic factors. If there's any like, if you're above X percent of unemployment rate, you can't impute, or you can only impute a certain amount, or so you have to do some extra things to say
Right.
like, this person we can impute on, but this average person we shouldn't because they're working in a place that there aren't any jobs.
That's a
Living
good-
in a place where there aren't any jobs.
That is a good question, and no. So the statewide guidelines, so imputation is a may law, right? It's not a shall law. So which means that you may impute them if you see it appropriate. So, but most often the state attorneys and the DAs feel it's appropriate if you cannot prove some kind of disability. They don't take into account the jobs and things because it's formulaic. So they don't take anything about the local economy, which is why I did this research, in when they're talking about these areas. And so the times when I've seen that they will go lower because there's a minimum $100 child support order if they decide not to impute. The minimum you could be ordered in Louisiana is $100. And so sometimes they do the minimum if you have no income. And I've seen that personally just done mostly in rural areas.
So
Because,
the minimum can't be zero.
no,
And that is a decision of the state, right?
Correct.
That's not a federal.
correct.
How common is that? I mean, do most states have a minimum that's a dollar amount, or do states?
I don't know. What about Wisconsin? Do they have a?
I think that most states have a minimum that's $1 that requires, like, I don't, that's not a zero amount. There's some that have like a
Mm-hmm.
what's the other S in SSR? Self-sufficiency.
Yes, right.
For peers, but I think that almost all states require some minimum dollar order.
Mm-hmm.
So a state could
Mm-hmm.
conceivably put in their statutes
Mhm.
that then in order to establish that minimum, they do need to take into account the local economy.
Yeah, they
Nothing's
could.
stopping them from doing it.
There's nothing stopping them from doing it. No, no. And because they do zero orders if you're incarcerated. No, excuse me, I said that wrong. They can do zero orders while you're incarcerated. The law provides for that. Do they do it? Not often, but they can. And so, because a lot of times they like to do the order. He's a captive audience, literally. And so I got him here. I know where he is. We're going to set this child support now. And it's not the child's fault that he's in jail. So he should accrue all these arrears while he's incarcerated, not thinking through the residual effects of that. Yes.
I have a comment that's somewhere between anecdotal and data-based.
Okay.
Please take it with a grain of salt. When I started working here as a data collector on the longitudinal child support study that included like a third of the Wisconsin counties, and what was striking to me was like, specifically about the arrears, not current support, that the rural counties seemed like when you start a contempt proceedings for dad's not paying, they seemed much more willing to be patient and to work with
Really?
somebody who wasn't paying. Like, you see these contempt actions stretching out like 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, whereas like, in somewhere like Milwaukee County or Dane County, like, that's not going to happen. And so like, so I'm not a researcher, so I'm way out of my element here, but just like thinking of like my own personal ones, just thinking like caseload has to be, caseload probably has something to do with that, but also maybe just like, in a more rural area, you're more cognizant about the living conditions that your fellow citizens might be
Mhm.
experiencing, whereas
Mhm.
there can be a lot of variety in like an urban
Right.
county. Does that make sense? Like, so I don't know, maybe you've already thought about all this stuff.
And so that's one of the reasons I would like to also do this research in Wisconsin. Because I would argue that's a function of race. Who are the people in those rural counties? They're more likely white in Wisconsin, and the people in urban counties are more likely black in Milwaukee. And so I think that would be more of a function of race. This person looks like you, so I'm willing to give them more chances and stretch this out. And I know their economic situations. Whereas at the same time in urban areas, I know your economic situation, but do better, black man. So, yes.
Super fascinating, Maretta. Thanks. I have a follow-up question to that conversation. I agree that my prior would be that there's a difference in race in rural counties in Wisconsin and Louisiana. But my follow-up question to that is like, if that's the case, is there data on who the discretionary decision makers are in these rural counties? So if you could get data on, I don't know if they're judges or if there's a middle person between a judge and a BA level person who kinds of makes these discretionary decisions. From your work, I would think you would hypothesize that if it's same within group, judge and person subject to CSE, then you might get a more favorable outcome. But if it's out groups, as the judge in the CSE, especially if the CSE person is black and the judge is not, then you would expect to see more punitive. Is that right?
No. So let me tell you why I think that would be different. Let's think about Tyree and the criminal justice system. All those officers were black, okay? And I think it's a shared morality lens that they may have. Whereas if there's a more progressive judge, he may see the humanity in the people. Whereas if they're more like the authoritarian type of judge or caseworker or DA, then they're more likely to ask for harsher measures and grant harsher measures, is what I would think. And so, and it's more likely for you to think as moralistically that racially, when you think about this moral compass of the middle class types of idealism, that poor people, they did this to themselves, and so they have to get themselves out of it. And so you're not working hard enough to get yourself out of this poverty or help your family, or you're not responsible. And so I think that even if it's a black judge and a black person, I still think that there's that relationship between authority and subjectivity that will have also lends itself to more black men being present and brutalized.
I wanted to follow up because I do agree with you, because the one thing I want to say a lot of things, but I want to put one thing. One is that the system is racist. We don't talk about that. The police system is racist, child support is racist, and they also are paternalistic, and they also are driven by money. Child support as a legal organization is a collection agency, and they have a job to collect money. And people don't want to. That's what I see when I sit in the courtroom. And one thing I just wrote a report that's coming out, I guess today, with Lisa. We just wrote a report for CSE for the state, and I observed 200 cases this past summer. The one thing that was very clear is child support runs the courtroom. To me, that's my opinion. Because the judge and the child support lawyer were in conversation the whole time deciding what to do. But then the judge often deferred to the child support person, who was a legal lawyer.
Right.
And then they just would move forward. That's mine. I want to do more work. It was one time I looked at it. Hopefully I'll get money to do more of that.
Yes.
But it was just very interesting. And also what I came to think about was, I would even challenge what you're doing to say, it's not just race. I would even take away race and look at class.
Okay.
Because we're talking about poor people and how poor people are treated. Race does come in there,
Okay.
But it just was, how do we look at and value the humanity of people who had no money?
Right.
And who use social welfare services.
Mhm.
Because what I saw when people would come in there and they were getting child care benefits, but they were told they had to have a child support order. And they didn't even know that was a requirement of this opportunity to take
Wow.
care of my kids. I was shocked. And couples would come in saying, why are we here? Well, you got child care and you have to get a child support order. And they were living together, raising their children. Their life
Wow.
was fine. And the mother had no idea that she was agreeing to that. She was cooperating.
Mhm.
You talk about cooperation. She was cooperating. She was signing a form that she knew she didn't have it. So also another final thing is the Turnaby Rogers case. If you have data that goes beyond, Turnaby Rogers was 2012, which
Right.
you shouldn't have an order if you can't afford it.
Right.
I was very engaged in that court case. I know what it's.
Right.
And I've looked at it with Tanya Breeden. We've written papers about that.
Right.
And people don't even know the Supreme Court case which says people should have 0 orders if they have no money.
Right.
Judges don't know that. Lawyers don't, and it's a case that's supposed to protect you. So anyway, I'll talk to you more.
But first, one thing, I still want to push back on about the race thing, because I feel like in my models, I accounted for this difference in poverty, this difference in being able to get a job, low wages, and race still mattered. You know what I mean? So it's like, if I control for class, race shouldn't matter no more, right? Because we know that black people are more disadvantaged, right? So I account for all that disadvantage. Why race still matter though? So, you know, let's go. Let's go. All right, Elijah. Who had the hand? Yes.
I was gonna say, I think we're at.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, everyone, for being engaged. Email me with your comments if you have some. I want to hear them. Thank you so much.